Hello, fellow history lovers and English learners. Welcome back to our cozy archives. Did you know that beneath the dark, crushing weight of the Atlantic waves lies a secret that changed the path of the human story forever? For thousands of years, philosophers, explorers, and dreamers have looked toward the horizon with a single question in their minds. They wonder if a magnificent empire truly existed or if it was just a beautiful dream from the mind of an ancient philosopher. This is the legend of Atlantis, a city of gold and light that vanished in a single day and night of fire and water. Imagine a world that existed 9,000 years before the time of the great Greek thinkers. This was a land of ultimate beauty and incredible wealth. It was a place where the gods themselves walked among men. The story begins with Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea. He was the protector and the creator of this island nation. He fell in love with a mortal woman named Plato. She lived on a central hill on a vast island in the middle of the ocean. To protect her and her children, Poseidon carved the earth into a series of perfect, concentric circles. There were 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land. These rings were perfectly round and separated by deep channels. The design of the city was a miracle of ancient engineering. The island was a hub of trade and wisdom. People from every corner of the known world wanted to see its shining walls. The outer walls were covered in brass. The inner walls shone with the dull gray light of tin. But the most inner wall, the one surrounding the royal citadel, was covered in a mysterious metal called orichalcum. This metal was said to flash with the red light of fire. It was more precious than gold at that time. Inside this citadel stood the temple of Poseidon. It was an enormous structure decorated with gold, silver, and ivory. The ceiling was made of solid ivory. It was patterned with gold and silver decorations. Chapter 1: The Divine Blueprint and the 10 Kings. The island was not just a single city, but a massive continent of resources. Poseidon had 10 sons with Plato. He divided the island into 10 separate regions. Each son was a king and ruled over his own territory. The eldest son was named Atlas. He was the supreme ruler over all the others. The entire island and the ocean surrounding it were named after him. The kings lived in peace for many generations. They followed the laws that Poseidon had written on a giant pillar of orichalcum. This pillar stood in the center of the island. Every 5 or 6 years, the kings met at the temple to discuss the laws. They made sacrifices to the sea god to ensure the continued prosperity of their people. During this golden age, the soil of Atlantis was incredibly fertile. The earth provided 2 harvests every year. One harvest came from the winter rains and the other from the summer sun. Wild animals roamed the forests. There were even elephants, which showed the tropical nature of the climate. The mountains were tall and protected the plains from the cold northern winds. The citizens built massive bridges to connect the rings of land. They dug tunnels so that large ships could sail through the rings of water directly into the heart of the city. It was a busy port filled with sailors and merchants. The air was filled with the sounds of different languages and the smell of expensive spices. The military power of Atlantis was also legendary. The kings commanded a force of 10,000 chariots and 1,200 ships. They had thousands of archers, slingers, and stone throwers. Their influence reached far beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This was the name the ancients gave to the Strait of Gibraltar. They conquered parts of Libya and reached as far as Egypt. They also controlled parts of Europe, including Tyrrhenia. Their power seemed unstoppable. Their navy was the largest the world had ever seen. The ships were made of the finest wood from the Atlantean mountains. Every sailor was trained to be a master of the unpredictable sea. Chapter 2: The Prosperity of the Golden Age. Life in Atlantis was a model of perfection and harmony. The people were known for their gentle spirits and great wisdom. They did not value gold or silver as much as they valued virtue. To them, the physical wealth of the island was just a secondary gift. They understood that friendship and justice were the true treasures of a civilization. The kings were not tyrants. They ruled with kindness and respect for the ancient laws. The people lived in beautiful houses built from red, black, and white stones. These stones were quarried from the center of the island. The architecture was both simple and grand. Every garden was filled with exotic flowers and cool fountains. The center of the island was a place of luxury. There were hot and cold springs for bathing. The kings had private baths, and there were also separate baths for the citizens. There were even baths specifically designed for horses and cattle. Nothing was neglected in this planned society. The plains around the city were perfectly flat and rectangular. The inhabitants had dug a massive canal around the entire plain. This canal was 100 feet deep and 600 feet wide. It collected the water from the mountains and directed it into the city. This irrigation system allowed the farmers to grow food for millions of people. It was a masterpiece of human ingenuity and hard work. In this era, the culture of Atlantis flourished. There were great schools for the arts and sciences. The priests of Poseidon studied the stars and the movements of the planets. They possessed knowledge that seemed magical to other nations. They understood the tides and the secrets of the deep ocean. Music and poetry were part of every festival. The people believed that their society would last forever. They felt protected by the great god of the sea. They felt secure behind their triple walls and their massive navy. However, time has a way of changing even the strongest hearts. Prosperity began to slowly change the character of the Atlanteans. Chapter 3: The Shadow of Arrogance. As the centuries passed, the divine nature of the people began to fade. The blood of the gods became mixed with too much mortal blood. The humans who lived on the island became greedy and ambitious. They stopped caring about virtue and justice. Instead, they focused on expanding their power and gathering more wealth. The simple life of the past was forgotten. The kings became proud and looked at the rest of the world with hunger. They wanted to conquer every land they could see. The harmony between the 10 kings started to break down. They competed for glory and prestige. The corruption of Atlantis was a slow process. It did not happen in a single generation. It was like a poison that spread through the veins of the empire. The majestic temples were still there, but the hearts of the worshippers were empty. The orichalcum walls still shone, but they hid a society of decadence. The leaders became obsessed with military conquest. They began to treat the neighboring nations as slaves rather than partners. The great wisdom of the priests was used to create weapons of war instead of tools for peace. The gods watched from high above on Mount Olympus. They were not pleased with what they saw. The turning point came when Atlantis decided to launch a massive invasion. They gathered their 1,200 ships and their 10,000 chariots. They aimed their sights on the eastern Mediterranean. They wanted to enslave Egypt and the early city-state of Athens. This was a moment of great crisis for the ancient world. Most nations were too terrified to resist. They saw the massive Atlantean navy and surrendered without a fight. Only one city stood tall against the invaders. That city was Athens. The Athenians were not as wealthy or as numerous as the Atlanteans, but they possessed a courage that the corrupted empire had long since lost. Chapter 4: The Heroism of Ancient Athens. Athens led the resistance against the Atlantean army. They formed a coalition of Greek states to fight for their freedom. However, as the war grew more difficult, the allies became afraid. One by one, the other Greek cities abandoned the cause. Eventually, Athens was left to fight the massive empire alone. It was a classic battle between a small, virtuous state and a giant, greedy power. The Athenian soldiers were brave and disciplined. They fought with a love for their land and their freedom. They managed to push back the Atlantean forces in several key battles. The defeat of the Atlantean army by the Athenians was a shocking event. It proved that numbers and wealth were not enough to win a war. The Athenians showed the world that a free people could defeat any tyrant. They liberated the nations that had been enslaved by the Atlanteans. They restored the balance of power in the Mediterranean. This victory is one of the most celebrated parts of the legend. It was a triumph of the human spirit over physical force. But the real drama was still to come. The gods had decided that the time for words and wars was over. The pride of Atlantis had to be punished. While the Athenians were celebrating their victory, the earth began to tremble. Zeus, the king of the gods, gathered the other gods in his most holy home. He spoke to them about the fate of the island. He saw that a once noble race had fallen into a state of misery. He wanted to teach them a lesson that the world would never forget. He did not want to destroy them out of anger. He wanted to punish them so that they might remember their divine origins. However, the punishment he chose was far more severe than anyone expected. The ocean, which had been the source of their life, was about to become their grave. Chapter 5. The Night of the Great Cataclysm. The end of Atlantis did not come with a long war or a slow decline. It happened with a sudden and violent fury. In a single day and night of intense misfortune, the island was destroyed. Great earthquakes shook the foundations of the world. The mountains cracked and fire burst from the earth. The beautiful cities and the great rings of land were torn apart. The citizens ran to the temples for protection, but the gods did not answer their prayers. The sea god Poseidon, who had once built the island, now sent the waves to claim it back. The description of the destruction is terrifying. Huge tsunamis, higher than the tallest towers, crashed into the coast. The bridges were washed away. The great ships were smashed against the harbor walls. The ground beneath the city opened up and swallowed the royal palace. The air was thick with ash and the screams of the dying. The golden age was being erased by the power of nature. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the island of Atlantis was gone. It had sunk beneath the cold, dark waters of the ocean. Only a few survivors were left to tell the story to the surrounding nations. The ocean where the island had once stood became impossible to navigate. For a long time, sailors reported that the sea was full of mud and silt. This was because the sinking of the island had left a massive amount of debris in the water. The trade routes were blocked. The memory of the empire began to fade into myth. People found it hard to believe that such a magnificent place could disappear so quickly. The story was passed down through the generations. It traveled from the survivors to the Egyptians. Then, it traveled from the Egyptians to the wise men of Greece. Chapter 6. Plato and the Secret Records. We know this story mainly because of the Greek philosopher Plato. He wrote about Atlantis in two of his famous works. These books are called Timaeus and Critias. Plato lived in the 4th century before the birth of Christ. He claimed that the story was not a fiction. He said it was a true history that had been preserved by the priests of Egypt. According to Plato, a Greek statesman named Solon visited Egypt 200 years before Plato's time. While he was there, he talked to an old priest in the city of Sais. The priest told Solon that the Greeks were like children because they had forgotten their own history. The priest showed Solon ancient records written on temple walls. These records described the rise and fall of Atlantis in great detail. Solon was amazed by the story. He planned to write an epic poem about it, but he never finished it. The story was passed down through his family until it reached Plato. Plato used the story to illustrate his ideas about politics and morality. He wanted to show how a perfect society can become corrupt if the leaders lose their virtue. He used the contrast between the virtuous Athens and the greedy Atlantis to make a point about the dangers of empire. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Plato was telling the truth. Some believe that he invented the story as a political allegory. They think he wanted to warn the people of Athens about the dangers of their own growing naval power. Other scholars believe that there must be a grain of truth in the legend. They point out that Plato provides very specific measurements and descriptions. He talks about the types of stone, the names of the kings, and the layout of the harbor. Why would a philosopher include so many technical details if the story was just a fairy tale? The search for the real Atlantis has never stopped. Chapter 7. The Hunt for the Sunken Kingdom. In the modern age, the mystery of Atlantis has captured the imagination of scientists and explorers. Many theories have been proposed about where the island might be located. Some people look toward the Atlantic Ocean, just as Plato described. They believe that a large island could have existed near the Azores or the Canary Islands. They search the sea floor for evidence of sunken walls or ancient statues. So far, no clear evidence has been found. The depths of the Atlantic are vast and mostly unexplored. The pressure and the darkness make it very difficult to find small ruins from thousands of years ago. Another popular theory points to the Mediterranean Sea. Some researchers believe that Atlantis was actually the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. This civilization was very advanced and wealthy. However, it was devastated by a massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera. This island is now known as Santorini. The eruption occurred around 1600 years before the birth of Christ. It was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. It caused huge tsunamis and changed the climate of the region. The sudden destruction of the Minoan power fits the timeline of a single day and night of catastrophe. There are also theories that place Atlantis in more exotic locations. Some people suggest it could be in the Caribbean, near the Bahamas. They point to the Bimini Road, which looks like a sunken stone path. Others believe it might be in the Sahara Desert, at a place called the Rikhat structure. This is a series of massive, natural concentric rings in Mauritania. From the sky, it looks remarkably like Plato's description of the city. Perhaps the ocean moved over thousands of years, or perhaps the story was slightly different than we remember. The possibilities are endless, and each one adds a new layer to the mystery. Chapter 8. The Science of Catastrophe and Memory. Could a large island really sink into the ocean in a single day? Geologists say it is unlikely for a whole continent to disappear that fast. However, sea levels have risen significantly since the last ice age. 10,000 years ago, the world looked very different. Large areas of land that are now underwater were once dry ground. Doggerland, for example, was a vast plain connecting England to mainland Europe. It was swallowed by the rising North Sea. Perhaps Atlantis was a victim of these rising waters. The memory of a lost homeland could have been passed down for thousands of years as a legend. The power of memory is a strange thing. Human beings tend to turn historical facts into myths over time. A small volcanic eruption becomes a divine fire. A seasonal flood becomes a global deluge. The story of Atlantis might be a combination of several different historical events. It might represent the end of the Ice Age and the destruction of several early coastal civilizations. To the ancient people, the world seemed small and fragile. A local disaster could feel like the end of the entire world. This would explain why so many cultures have stories about a great flood or a lost paradise. In recent years, underwater archaeology has become more advanced. We now have sonar and deep-sea robots that can map the ocean floor. We have found many sunken cities in the Mediterranean and near India. These discoveries show us that the sea is full of secrets. Every time we find a new ruin, we ask the same question. Is this the lost city? Is this the place that Plato described? Even if we never find the exact site, the search itself is valuable. It teaches us about our past and about the relationship between humans and the environment. It reminds us that no civilization, no matter how powerful, is permanent. Chapter 9. The Eternal Message of the Myth. Beyond the search for physical ruins, the legend of Atlantis carries a deep psychological meaning. It represents the dream of a perfect world. It is a symbol of our desire to return to a golden age of peace and abundance. But it is also a warning about the dangers of pride and the loss of morality. The story tells us that wealth and power are not enough to sustain a society. If we forget our values, we risk losing everything we have built. This message is just as relevant today as it was in the time of Plato. The story of Atlantis has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. From the poems of the Middle Ages to the science fiction movies of today, the image of the sunken city continues to fascinate us. It represents the mystery of the unknown. It reminds us that there are still many things we do not understand about our own planet. The deep ocean is like a time capsule. It preserves the ghosts of the past in its silent depths. As long as the waves continue to roll, people will continue to wonder what lies beneath them. The mystery of the lost city of Atlantis remains one of the greatest riddles of human history. Was it a real empire, a historical memory, or a philosophical lesson? Perhaps it was a little bit of all three. The truth may be hidden under kilometers of water and layers of ancient mud. Or perhaps the truth is hidden within ourselves, in our dreams and our fears. The story of the 10 kings and the golden walls will continue to be told. It will always serve as a reminder of the fragility of human greatness. What do you think is the real truth behind this ancient legend? Do you believe that a physical city called Atlantis is still waiting to be discovered on the ocean floor? Or is the story more important as a lesson for our own modern society? Did the people of Atlantis truly perish in the waves, or did they find a new beginning somewhere else? As you think about these questions, remember that history is not just about the past. It is about the lessons we carry with us into the future.